You know that moment when someone tries to flex their authority without realizing they're talking to the actual authority? I've been the county sheriff here in Cedar Grove for 15 years, and I've lived in my house on Maple Street even longer. It's a quiet neighborhood where people used to mind their own business, wave hello, and share the occasional barbecue. That all changed when the new development went up next door and our little community suddenly became desirable real estate. I first met Karen Thompson at the neighborhood welcome party. She'd moved in with her family and immediately started talking about improving property values and community standards. Within weeks, she'd gathered a group of like-minded neighbors and formed what she called a voluntary homeowners association. I got their first letter on a Tuesday, all about joining their effort to create a more beautiful community. Being both a resident and the sheriff, I know every local ordinance by heart. I wrote back politely, explaining that while I appreciated their enthusiasm, I preferred to maintain my property according to actual county regulations. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The letters kept coming, each one more insistent than the last. Then Karen started her documentation walks. Every morning, she'd stroll through the neighborhood with her phone out, taking pictures of what she called violations. My weather-beaten mailbox seemed to particularly offend her. Sure, it wasn't pretty, but it was sturdy, the same one my dad helped me put up 20 years ago. I first ran into Karen at Miller's Grocery. I was picking up milk when she cornered me between the cereal aisle and the bread section. "Sheriff Mitchell," she said, though she didn't know that was my title. "Your mailbox is bringing down property values. We've had complaints." I remember smiling, mostly because I knew every complaint that came through the sheriff's office, and none had been about mailboxes. "Ma'am," I said, "the mailbox meets all county regulations." She didn't like that answer one bit. "Well," she huffed, "we'll just see what the authorities have to say about that." I almost told her right then that I was the authority she'd be calling. But sometimes life's little ironies are best left to play out on their own. Over the next week, I watched her make several calls from her front porch. I could see her gesturing at my mailbox while she talked. Each time, I knew she was calling the sheriff's office my office. My deputies kept telling me about the persistent woman from Maple Street, who wanted to file a complaint about mailbox violations. They thought it was hilarious that she hadn't made the connection. Then came the neighborhood newsletter. Karen had started it herself, complete with a special section about properties of concern. My mailbox made the front page. The photo showed it from its worst angle, the evening sun highlighting every scratch and dent from 20 years of faithful service. The article mentioned getting local law enforcement involved. My neighbors who'd known me for years found it entertaining. Old Bill from across the street would wave and point at the mailbox, barely containing his laughter. Even Mrs. Henderson, who was actually in the HOA, quietly told me she thought the whole thing was ridiculous. I did consider painting the mailbox, just to keep the peace. But something about Karen's approach rubbed me the wrong way. In my years of law enforcement, I'd learned that giving in to unreasonable demands rarely leads to peace. It just encourages more demands. So I waited, knowing that sooner or later, Karen would make good on her threats to bring in the authorities. I kept an extra uniform pressed and ready. After 23 years in law enforcement, I've learned that presentation matters, especially in situations like this. The whole thing was building up like a summer storm. You could feel the tension in the neighborhood. Karen's group had started issuing violation notices. Not real ones, mind you, just printed papers that looked official until you read the fine print. My mailbox had collected quite a collection of them, each one filed neatly away in my home office. Some neighbors started avoiding each other. The usual weekend chats across fences got shorter. Even the kids seemed to pick up on it, sticking closer to their own yards. It wasn't the neighborhood I'd known and served for all these years. Something had to give. I knew Karen had been trying to reach me at the office all week. My deputies kept a log of her calls, each one more urgent than the last. She'd even tried to file a formal complaint, but since there wasn't actually any violation, it hadn't gone anywhere. I could have stopped it all with one phone call, but sometimes people need to learn things the hard way. I just didn't expect her to bring a rookie cop to my door quite so soon. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I heard the confident knock on my front door. Through the window, I could see Karen standing there with Officer Tommy Jenkins, one of our newest recruits. Tommy had only been on the force for 3 months, and I could tell from his stance that he was uncomfortable. Karen, on the other hand, was practically bouncing with excitement. I took my time answering the door, making sure my sheriff's uniform was properly buttoned. When I opened it, Karen started talking before she even looked up from her clipboard. Finally, we can deal with this mailbox situation properly. I've brought Officer Jenkins to Dash. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw my uniform, her mouth hanging open slightly. Poor Tommy looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. His face had gone from professional to terrified in the span of 2 seconds. Sheriff Mitchell, sir, I wasn't told. He stammered, his hand dropping from where it had been resting on his belt. Karen's face went through a remarkable series of changes: confusion, disbelief, embarrassment, and finally, a desperate attempt to maintain dignity. "You're the sheriff?" she asked, her voice higher than usual. But why didn't you say anything?" I leaned against my doorframe, crossing my arms. "You never asked, ma'am. Though I believe you've spoken to my office several times this week." Tommy was trying very hard not to smile now, his earlier fear giving way to appreciation of the situation. Karen clutched her clipboard tighter, her knuckles turning white. But the mailbox, the violations, the community standards. She was grasping at straws now, her carefully planned confrontation crumbling around her. "Officer Jenkins," I said calmly, "would you like to explain to Mrs. Thompson here what constitutes an actual county violation?" Tommy straightened up immediately, professional training kicking in. "Yes, sir. Mrs. Thompson, I've reviewed the county ordinances, and the mailbox in question meets all legal requirements. It's structurally sound, properly placed, and meets Postal Service regulations." He paused, glancing at me before continuing. "In fact, bringing law enforcement into a voluntary HOA dispute could be considered a misuse of police resources." Karen's face had turned an interesting shade of red. Across the street, I could see Bill pretending to water his lawn while watching the whole thing. Mrs. Henderson had come out to check her mail 3 times in the last 5 minutes. "But you're a police officer," Karen said to Tommy, trying one last time. "Can't you at least write a warning or something?" I decided it was time to end this. "Mrs. Thompson, Officer Jenkins reports to me. And more importantly, your HOA has no legal authority over non-members. Now, I'd appreciate it if you'd stop putting notices on my mailbox and taking pictures of my property." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of Bill's sprinkler and a kid's bicycle bell somewhere down the street. Karen looked from me to Tommy, then back to me, like she was watching a tennis match. I need to make some phone calls," she finally said, backing away from my door. Tommy quickly tipped his hat to me and hurried after her, probably eager to get back to real police work. I watched them walk away, Karen speed-walking in her designer sneakers, while Tommy followed at a professional distance. From various windows and porches along the street, curtains twitched and heads quickly disappeared. The neighborhood gossip network would be buzzing within minutes. Mrs. Henderson gave up pretending and walked right over to my yard. "Well," she said, trying to hide her smile, "I guess that explains why none of our complaints to the sheriff's office went anywhere." She had been one of the few HOA members who always stayed friendly, even after Karen's influence grew. "How long do you think she'll take to resign as HOA president?" I asked, and Mrs. Henderson actually laughed out loud. "Oh, I'd give it till Monday at the latest. Some of us only joined because we thought we had to." Karen made it sound mandatory for everyone eventually. I nodded, understanding how these things usually went. Maybe it's time for a real community meeting. One where everyone can speak freely about what they want for the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson brightened at that idea. "I'll spread the word. And Sheriff, that mailbox really could use a coat of paint." She winked and headed back to her house, already pulling out her phone. I looked at my old mailbox, still standing sturdy despite its weathered appearance. Maybe it was time for a fresh coat of paint. Not because Karen demanded it, but because sometimes change can be good when it's your choice. The important thing was it would be my decision, just like it had always been. Tommy's patrol car started up, and I watched as he drove away. I'd have to have a talk with him on Monday about checking addresses more carefully before agreeing to these kinds of visits. But for now, I was content knowing that sometimes the best lessons come from unexpected situations. The story of the mailbox showdown spread through Cedar Grove faster than wildfire in July. By Sunday evening, my phone was buzzing with messages from neighbors I hadn't heard from in months. Some were apologizing for getting caught up in Karen's HOA fever. Others were sharing their own stories of run-ins with her rules and regulations. Bill from across the street brought over a 6-pack and spent an hour telling me about how Karen had tried to fine him for having a basketball hoop in his driveway. Mrs. Henderson called to say Karen hadn't been seen outside her house since Saturday's incident, though her car had been spotted at the real estate office in town. I decided it was time to bring our community back together. Working with some of the longtime residents, we arranged a neighborhood meeting at the community center. No clipboards, no violation notices, just honest conversation about what kind of neighborhood we wanted to be. The turnout was bigger than anyone expected. Almost every house on Maple Street was represented, though Karen's family was noticeably absent. People brought snacks and drinks, making it feel more like a party than a meeting. Even Tommy Jenkins showed up, though he was off duty and sat in the back, still looking a bit embarrassed about the whole thing. I stood up to speak, not as the sheriff, but as a neighbor who'd lived here for 20 years. "Look," I said, "we all want the same thing, a good place to live, friendly neighbors, and peace and quiet. We don't need formal rules and threats to make that happen. We just need to talk to each other and work things out like neighbors should." The relief in the room was almost physical. People started sharing stories, laughing about some of the more ridiculous HOA violations they'd received. One family had been cited for having a flower garden with non-approved colors. Another got in trouble for leaving their garbage can out 10 minutes too long after collection. Mrs. Henderson stood up and officially announced her resignation from the HOA board. "I joined thinking it would help the community," she said. "But all it did was divide us. I miss the way things used to be, when we actually talked to each other instead of writing citations." Others followed her lead. Within an hour, the HOA had lost most of its members. We drafted a simple neighborhood agreement instead. Not rules, just common-sense guidelines about being good neighbors. Help each other out, keep your property tidy enough not to cause problems, and talk things through if issues come up. The meeting turned into an impromptu cookout when someone suggested grilling the hot dogs they'd brought as snacks. Kids who'd been kept apart by invisible property lines were soon playing together on the community center lawn. It felt like the neighborhood was taking a deep breath after holding it for too long. I found myself talking with Tommy by the grill. "You know, Sheriff," he said, flipping a burger, "I learned more about community policing from watching this play out than I did in any training session." I had to agree. Sometimes the best lessons come from real-life situations. The next morning, a moving truck appeared in front of Karen's house. A "for sale" sign went up in the yard, looking oddly official next to my weather-beaten mailbox. Mrs. Henderson said Karen's husband had been transferred to another state, very suddenly and conveniently. As I watched them load up their furniture, I thought about how quickly things can change in a community. The voluntary HOA had dissolved completely by then, replaced by something better, actual neighborliness. People started helping each other out again, not because of rules, but because it was the right thing to do. My old mailbox became something of a neighborhood joke, in a good way. People would stop and take selfies with it, calling it the mailbox that broke the HOA. I did finally give it a fresh coat of paint, but only after the neighbors turned it into a community project. We had a mailbox painting party, complete with hot dogs and lemonade. Cedar Grove settled back into its natural rhythm. The kids played in front yards again, bikes and skateboards scattered across driveways. Garden hoses stretched across lawns without fear of citations, and basketball hoops appeared back in driveways. The neighborhood felt alive again. Last week, the new family moving into Karen's old house stopped by to introduce themselves. They'd heard all about the mailbox incident from their real estate agent and wanted to know if it really happened. I just pointed them to my freshly painted but still slightly dented mailbox and told them they'd moved into a real community, not just a collection of houses. Sometimes I think about sending Karen a thank you note. In trying to force us all to be the same, she actually helped us remember why we were different, and how those differences, when respected, make a community stronger. My mailbox still stands proud, a little weathered, a little worn, but solid and real, just like our neighborhood. Today, Cedar Grove is known as one of the friendliest neighborhoods in the county. We still don't have an HOA, but we have something better. Neighbors who look out for each other, talk through their problems, and understand that community isn't built on rules and regulations, but on relationships and respect. And if you're ever in the area, just look for the famous mailbox on Maple Street. It'll show you the way home.